Welcome to the Oklahoma Memo podcast. My name is Ryan Welton, the founder and curator of Oklahoma Memo. It's a daily local news recap. It's a newsletter, but essentially what I do is that I go site to site, up and down the dial, from Miami to Altus, from Miami to Altus, from Guyman to Idabel across Oklahoma, looking for the best journalism in the state. And today I'm joined by who I think is probably the best investigative journalist in Oklahoma. And that's JC Hallman with Oklahoma Watch. And I followed, first time I saw you, JC, it was a story about something that was happening up in Guyman. And I thought, man, we're getting some stories from the Panhandle. But this story has really caught, you're right, has caught people's attention. State Farm, and it really emanated from a couple in Broken Arrow who had some issues with hail damage. And it turned out there are a lot of Oklahoma families with issues with hail damage. And this family decided to sue State Farm, and now the Attorney General is getting involved, trying to intervene and go after State Farm. And this is something that you've been following. I think you've done 3 stories so far. So in the spirit of getting right into it, what is going on with this investigation, and why is the Attorney General looking into State Farm?
Well, it turns out, and this is the most recent story I did, that this is not the first time that State Farm has been investigated for racketeering. I dug deep into, in my most recent story, into a case out of Illinois involving using aftermarket parts for car repairs that got State Farm in hot water 25 years ago. And then eventually, as they were trying to get their way out of that, they meddled in a Supreme Court election in Illinois, and then eventually were brought up on RICO charges for that. They wound up paying $250 million to get out of that, but they were on the hook for about $8 billion. So what seems to be happening in Oklahoma is a kind of sequel to, something that State Farm has done, got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, in the past, and they seem to be doing it again here in Oklahoma.
And what they're doing is pre-denying hail claims. Could you explain what that is? What do you mean they pre-deny hail claims?
Yeah, so I mean, all this started for me way back in May when I wrote a story about a claim that hail explained why Oklahoma has high homeowners insurance rates. And I've written a variety of stories on different things, on the nature of competition, I've got a story going to be publishing soon about in response to new legislation being proposed by the Oklahoma Insurance Department. Um, so I've been writing about a bunch of different things, but then the State Farm thing came to me with an anonymous text back in August. Somebody kind of out of the blue, in a very kind of cloak and daggery sort of way, reached out and said, "You got to go to this hearing in Oklahoma City." And I looked up the case that was referenced. I read all the filings on it. Took a whole weekend. And then I attended this hearing, and the story began to emerge. And what State Farm was alleged to have done was essentially arbitrarily set out to reduce the amounts they were paying out on certain kinds of claims by 50%. And that meant there was just going to be this blanket policy of pre-denying claims of hail and wind damage. It's all more complicated than that, because they weren't denying every claim. There's probably some kind of algorithm that they use to simultaneously pay some and not pay some, but they still save billions of dollars in the long run. All the details are not known, because all of this was supposed to be happening in secret. But I started attending the hearings, and got to where I kind of understood what was happening. And it had started out with about 125 cases of this happening, because this started happening in Oklahoma, and some of the people who were having their claims denied called lawyers. Those lawyers called other lawyers. The cases began to accumulate. They were all being litigated. And then at a certain point in this first group of cases, What happened was the State Farm suddenly settled all of them, sometimes for really surprisingly high amounts of money. A 20 or $30,000 claim could settle for as much as $3 million. And so it looked like they were trying to make these cases go away so they wouldn't have to reveal what was really happening.
Mm.
Uh, and so, I mean, it's all very complicated, and it's hard to say exactly what's really going on because that fight over the documentation is still ongoing. But it's very clear that there's a lot of money involved, and that State Farm, just as they did with that earlier case, will go to almost any lengths, hundreds of millions of dollars, to try to not have to explain what's really happening.
And this is where I would encourage viewers or listeners to go back and read your work at Oklahoma Watch because those earlier cases, I think, really inform this one. And you spoke of documentation just now. Does this sort of inform why Gentner Drummond is getting involved?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that because, even in what I was looking at, there were two sets of cases, right? There was the first 125 cases, and now there's maybe 60 or 70 more. And what had happened is the law firm in Oklahoma City, Witten Burridge, that won access to those documents and was deposing executives in that first batch of cases. They'd gotten to the point where they were seeing the materials, but then they had like a view and destroy order or something, when the case is settled, they didn't have access to them anymore. But now that there's another 60 or 70 cases popping up, and the most public facing of those is this Tulsa police lieutenant named Billy Hirsch. And so that case is sort of the figurehead for it all now. And there's a new fight over documents. But the difference is that they're not fighting over documents that these lawyers have not already seen. So they're saying in open court what they saw in the documents, but they don't have access to the documents anymore. So it's a new fight over that. And of course, State Farm can fight tooth and nail to try to prevent it from happening again. And that's partly why the attorney general stepped in because he has greater subpoena powers than just a law firm that is arguing a case. I mean, there's going to be a fight over that as well. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that eventually moved its way up to the Oklahoma Supreme Court in the long run. But it is, it's about proving something that we already know to be true in a sense, because the documents were already seen and the lawyers who are arguing these cases are talking about it in open court.
Where this becomes really troublesome, like a movie, is when I read your report of what happened in Illinois with that judge being elected, and it felt like something was not right about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that in that case, and there's some parallels here in Oklahoma that I'll be probably like pulling on some threads to find out about. But in that case, a former FBI agent who I just spoke with the other day, he was brought in, and then a private investigator, and what they were able to show was that this relatively obscure judge from a rural county in Illinois suddenly decided to run for the Supreme Court and raised millions of dollars to do so. And it took them a while to show it, but they were eventually able to show that about $4 million of his campaign chest was a huge portion of what he was able to raise had come directly from State Farm. And then, of course, he had won his election, and then one of the first things that he did as a judge was go on to become the deciding vote that let State Farm out of about $1 billion in jury verdict money. And that guy's career, he retired in 2020, but he went on to be the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. But it sure seems like he started out as a judge that was bought and paid for by State Farm.
Yeah, and that has to I mean, that just makes your blood boil a little bit, you when you hear something like that. Now, they're at risk for State Farm, billions and billions of dollars, but when I hear RICO and racketeering, I think criminal charges. Are there criminal I mean, could somebody from State Farm go to prison over this?
It's certainly been suggested that, yeah, that could happen. I mean, RICO charges in civil cases is kind of a unique thing, and I've seen it said that that RICO charges in a civil case is the only time like a civil defendant is required to plead not guilty. So it's kind of middle territory. And I don't, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the attorney general, so I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of that. But I have been hearing people say, people who know better than I do, that that they think it's possible that someone could wind up going to jail for all of this someday. I mean, I think it's still got to get bigger. Since my story started to appear. Um, my first story sort of suggested this was not Oklahoma. This program to pre-deny hail claims started in Texas and then moved into Oklahoma and a couple of other states, and then moved out to the rest of the country. So it's really a nationwide story. And since my first story appeared, I've had people contacting me from all over, from Georgia and Indiana and Ohio and Arkansas and Texas, and so it is still growing. The story is getting bigger, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if we wound up with similar batches of cases over this kind of thing in other states, as your big petition lawyers in other states who specialize in this kind of litigation, as they catch wind of what has been working in Oklahoma.
A couple of questions come to mind. Have you given thought as to who's going to play you in the movie? Because it feels like we're headed that way. But the other thing is that hail damage. That's what we're talking about here. But are there other instances of claims that are getting pre-denied that you've heard of? I mean, wildfire, for example. I don't know.
There are some other cases that are making their way through the courts, specifically for water leaks. And that I've seen some things about that. And and certainly people have contacted me and say, this is the same thing that's happening in auto insurance. That original State Farm case from 25 years ago was an auto insurance case, that they were using aftermarket parts for repairs to save money. So I think that it's not just a one-off. I think that the question of hail in Oklahoma had become was always a little strange. Hail is getting worse, because of climate change. It's not as though the hail doesn't exist as a phenomenon. And there is damage that is being done, and it could be that I don't know, maybe State Farm thought they could get away with something, and that it would fly under the radar, but it didn't. And what's strange is that getting caught does not seem to have inspired them to change their ways.
Right.
So I think at this point, even though we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, it hasn't been enough of a dent in State Farm for them to really um, take notice of it, which just goes to show you how much money they must be making.
I'm talking with J.C. Hallman of Oklahoma Watch, an investigative journalist looking into what's happened in Oklahoma with regard to hail claims and State Farm, and the Attorney General's now getting involved. Let me ask you this. The wheels of justice can turn slowly sometimes. How quick do you expect this to move? Is this a years long thing that's going to be going on?
I think State Farm will do everything they can to make it move as slowly as possible. The cases I'm looking at, the specific group of cases started in 2020. The alleged scheme is supposed to have started then, but I've encountered hail cases involving State Farm in the law firm that I'm looking at now, which Witten Burge, wait, from years before that, and then other cases that date back 20-25 years. It's incredibly slow. That first racketeering story from State Farm, it started in 1997 and it finally resolved in 2018. So this can take not years to resolve, but generations. And then they hope that it'll go away in the meantime, or that, as was the case in with that big settlement over the Supreme Court judges, they settled for $250 million. That sounds like a lot of money,
Mhm.
but they could have lost 8 billion. So in a sense that they got off with a sweetheart deal on that one. So I think they play the long game, right? And that works well for the corporate person who doesn't actually age, because corporations are not people, right? So, but I think that you know, I as in the case with any Supreme Court proceeding, if the attorney general's motion to intervene is granted, and I believe the date for the next filing from State Farm about that is today, that they have to respond to that by today. And I think there's going to be a hearing on December 30th in Oklahoma City. And if that motion to intervene is granted, then I assume that State Farm will appeal that, try to take it to the Supreme Court. That process could easily take months.
And if we get to November 2026, I mean, we're going to have a new attorney general. Would this, I mean, so Ganner Drummond requests to intervene. What if the next attorney general says, nah, I don't want anything to do with this?
Well, I've been interviewing some of the candidates that are looking to replace Glenn Mulvaney, who is term limited and can't run again. And I've spoken, or I've communicated with two of the four who announced their candidacies. And that doesn't seem to be the narrative, right? That the narrative is that people see that this is wrong. There's been a lot of outrage around the state for a long time, and people want substantive things to be done about it, not just the State Farm case, but about skyrocketing homeowners insurance rates in general. So you know, there's always the chance that lobbyists and State Farm itself will make its weight and its financial resources known. But I would think that the story getting out is going to make it very difficult for anybody who wants to ascend to that position to risk taking State Farm money, and thinking, well, what would happen if I got caught, right? So I kind of sense, I mean, this is an example of putting the stories out there and allowing that light to disinfect the situation, and maybe for both whoever becomes governor, and whoever becomes next commissioner, there can be some insulation against having the insurance lobby or insurance companies having too much influence.
When do you anticipate your next story? Might it be after today once you find out what happens with State Farm, or might it be December 30th whenever that hearing were to happen?
Um, Both of those are possibilities. I have a different story just about the reactions to the proposed legislation that has been put forward, not directly about the State Farm stuff. There are a few different angles that I'm continuing to look at, or what's going to be a next State Farm story. Probably one that focuses on a particular case in Oklahoma City, that speaks about fortified routes, which is the big thing that the commissioner has been talking about. And that involves State Farm, but then it also, I think it'll let me touch on just how broad the response has been to the story. Hearing stories about all these other things happening in other places, and I would expect that to be publishing, sometime early in the new year.
Well, it will be a story that will be in the Oklahoma Memo newsletter recap for sure. And I'm working this, as I mentioned to you before we got on here. I like to I want to work these podcasts backwards and really get into the meat of the story at the beginning. But I also want to take an opportunity to help folks get to know you. I find that as people get to know the journalists and who they are and their experience and their background, there is a trust that builds. So, JC, tell me, when did you start working with Oklahoma Watch? What's your background? What would you want the people to know about you?
Yeah, so I started working with Oklahoma Watch about a year ago now, and I came from a background of writing deeply researched nonfiction books. So I'm not trained as a traditional newspaper journalist. I went from writing books. I've done a lot of deep dive magazine stuff, for places like the New Republic and the Nation and Harper's Magazine, and I've kind of slowly worked backward to writing for, for newspapers. And Oklahoma Watch
Mhm.
is an independent news source whose stories become available to newspapers. They publish on our website, of course, Oklahoma Watch. You can easily Google that,
Mhm.
but but the stories then get reprinted in newspapers across the state. So it's almost like a little miniature version of the Associated Press just for Oklahoma. And I found that to be a really good use of my skill set. It started out with me writing about some stuff in Guyman. And you mentioned earlier the wheels of justice turning slowly. I've been researching a story out there since last February.
Mhm.
And we're just on the brink of I sued the state of Oklahoma to get access to some documents, and that's just now settling. And I'm going to be able to write that story, but it's almost a year later now. And so it's been I've been able to really call on my experience writing books, which are almost invariably years long
Mhm.
processes. And bringing that kind of a deep dive sensibility. She was writing about everything from criminal justice in the Panhandle and rural Oklahoma, and there might be more coming about that with a longer project in the months to come, or guardianships in Oklahoma, or as it turns out, with a lot of stories about insurance.
As you mentioned before, this story has prompted people to reach out to you. I would imagine the more stories you do here in Oklahoma, the more popular you're going to become and people will reach out to you. How do you discern what to pursue versus what not to pursue?
It's really hard, that there's so many stories, and I'll like lie awake at night just staring at the ceiling and thinking about some really heartbreaking stories that I just can't pursue for one reason or another. Um, Often it's a question of access, or it's a question of whether a story is a one-off or represents a kind of trend. Um, you know, Sometimes it can be the mandate of Oklahoma Watch. The thing is we have funders, they're looking for coverage of certain kinds of subjects, and that can play a role. So, sometimes I'll take a story idea to my editor and he'll just say, "No, no, we're not doing that." And so it's mysterious. Specifically with the insurance story. My editor first gave me the idea to be writing about insurance. Um Maybe 11 months ago, and I have to admit, he said, "Why don't we write something about homeowners insurance?" And I said, "Ted, I've never even owned a home. I'm the worst guy in the world." And I really hedged and hawed because I thought it would be dull, and it is hard to understand, but I didn't understand that it was gonna have this kind of cloak and dagger element, that it was gonna read like a kind of John Grisham thriller, kind of a corporate thriller story, and th but it was like that didn't come until after I started publishing stuff. What he sent me as an idea, I didn't even really understand it when I first read it, and then I went back and reread it a few times. And then, I think I begged him to give it to somebody else and he didn't. And then eventually it just kind of clicked how I might approach writing about it. And I started to look around and I started to figure out an angle. I mean, that's what you're always looking for as a journalist. You know that most of the subjects you take on are too big for you to try to write about the whole thing. So we use that term, the journalistic angle, because you're really just talking about looking at a thing from one specific spot
Mhm.
and then trying to represent the whole from that particular angle. And I think that when I choose to write about something, it's when that idea of what the angle is kind of comes to me and sort of emerges out of my subconscious or whatever. I can't explain how that happens, but that probably does explain why I pick some stories over others.
Well, I think Oklahoma Watch found the perfect person in you to do this, and the background of nonfiction to this, I think, is quite apropos. In the if you happen to be
We've got a lot of great writers at Oklahoma
Oh,
Watch. I mean,
absolutely. Well, one of the things I've noticed, JC, about doing this with Oklahoma Memo, I'm a baseball fan, and I think in terms of baseball cards, I wish we had journalism baseball cards because I think of all the folks at Oklahoma Watch, Oklahoma Voice, KOSU, the Frontier. I mean, they're just I've only met a handful of them, but I recognize their work immediately, and I'm like, oh, this person's really a rock star in what they do. And my goal is to shine light on the light that you're shining out there. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's been a big surprise to me. I live in Tulsa, and what's happening in Tulsa right now, there's a number of different and new news outlets that are emerging. It's really a kind of golden age for different kinds of journalism, in Oklahoma in general. I mean, there's On Doc, there's The Voice, there's The Flyer, there's The Pickup. There's all these different outlets, and they're all doing things that are slightly different. It's and you put them all together, and we just have this massive range of coverage, that is happening and available.
well, one of not all of those newsrooms can afford to have a digital person to help them amplify, so I'm hope that I can sort of fulfill that role. And in the YouTube video for this, viewer, if you're watching this, I will have the links to all of JC's work on this story in the description. If you're listening to this on audio, be sure and leave us a 5-star review. That helps this get discovered by other folks. But I've been talking with JC Hallman about his series of stories in Oklahoma Watch with regard to State Farm. It's generated a ton of interest. And JC, I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.